To all the esteemed participants. A very warm welcome to all of you on this auspicious Constitution Day and to Dr. V.L. Mani Law Lecture on the topic Judicial Discretion versus Judicial Activism, delivered by Honorable Mr. Justice Devan Ramachandran, Judge High Court of Kerala, hosted by CG3, Connecting Governed, Governing and Governance. November 26th, the Constitution Day, also known as the National Law Day, is celebrated in India every year to commemorate the adoption of the Constitution of India by our Constituent Assembly on 26 November 1949, which came into effect on 26 January 1950. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has characterized judicial review as the heart of the Constitution. CG3, on this auspicious day, present to you this lecture in memory of our beloved teacher and founding member of CG3 who taught us the merits of connectivity. Dr. Venkat Lakshmanarayan Mani decorated the following positions during his lifetime as the Deputy Director of NLE Jodhpur, Professor and Dean of University of Petroleum and Energy Studies Dehradun, Professor at Hawassa University, Ethiopia, Executive Director at Vivekananda Institute of Professional Studies, New Delhi, Principal of Kerala Law Academy Law College, and Principal and Dean of HIT School of Law, Chennai. He has also penned several books and articles that have contributed to the legal arena. He has guided several scholars to conduct genuine research in law and achieve doctoral degree. Also, he holds the highest academic qualification in law as far as legal academia in Kerala is concerned. He completed his PhD and LLD from Berhampur University, Orissa. Dr. N.K. Jayakumar, former Vice Chancellor NUALS and patron CG3, remember Dr. V.L. Mani and said that Dr. Mani was a rare combination of academics and personal humility. This rare quality outshined him and distinguished him from others. He said he will be known for his inquisitiveness, skill, activeness, dedication to his duty, and commitment. Now, with this, let us now commence with the formal function. And I humbly invite the President of the meeting, Dr. K.P. Kailasnathar Pillai, Senior Counsel, Supreme Court of India. Sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, I cordially invite Advocate Bindu Suresh to deliver the welcome address. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Good evening, one and all. Thank you to everyone who has gathered here for today's Dr. V.L. Mani Memorial Law Lecture. As you all know, Dr. V.L. Mani sir was a founding member and one among the strong pillars of CG3. His loss is a big one for all of us. Certainly, it is true to state that this pandemic brought a lot of losses to our entire planet. As you all know, Dr. V.L. Mani sir was a rare combination of academics and personal humility. Before we carry on, I would like to say a few words about CG3. CG3 stands for Connecting, Governed, Governing, and Governance. We have judges, lawyers, academicians, and students who constitute a confluence of thoughts, ideas, and actions. During the pandemic, we have conducted several webinars with eminent speakers at both international and national level. At the time of the first annual day celebration, CG3 announced two projects. One is Law Awareness and Motivational Program, LAMP, for high school students, and Niyama Shilpashala, a workshop based on Panchayati Raj laws for elected members of Tridala Panchayat in 14 districts across Kerala. Both these projects are running successfully. 5 Niyama Shilpashala sessions and 19 sessions of LAMP are conducted so far. Now it's time for welcome address. First of all, I welcome Dr. K.P. Kailasnathar Pillai, Senior Advocate of Honorable Supreme Court of India and the Chief Mentor of CG3 for presiding over this meeting. A warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
I take pleasure and feel privileged to give a hearty welcome to our keynote speaker, Honorable Justice Devan Ramachandran, Judge of Honorable High Court of Kerala. A warm welcome to you, sir, on behalf of CG3 and my behalf. As you all know, there are a lot of notable judgments and remarks from the bench of Honorable Justice Devan Ramachandran, where he used his judicial discretion, and this had a huge positive impact on public life. It's an honor to have you as our keynote speaker, sir. May I also take this occasion to give a warm welcome to the family members who are informed to come to today's program of Dr. V.L. Mani sir's family members. We are delighted that you have joined us for this event. A very hearty welcome to all of you on behalf of CG3 and my behalf. Today's vote of thanks will be proposed by Advocate Nagaraj Narayan, who is the Special Government Pleader, Honorable High Court of Kerala and Director, Kerala Law Academy Law College, Thiruvananthapuram, and a member of CG3 Advisory Group. A very hearty welcome to you, sir, on behalf of CG3 and my behalf. Now, I welcome all the eminent guests and audience who have gathered here. Due to time constraint, if I miss out any name, I welcome all of you eminent personalities present here for this program. We are honored to have you all with us today. A very hearty welcome on behalf of CG3 and my behalf. Once again, a warm welcome to all the members who have gathered here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bindu ma'am, for the fervent welcome. Now, I request the CG3 technical team to play the CG3 theme song.
നീതിയും നിയമവും ജനപക്ഷത്തൊരുക്കുവാൻ CG3. നീതിയും നിയമവും ജനപക്ഷത്തൊരുക്കുവാൻ CG3. നിശബ്ദ കണ്ഠങ്ങളിൽ ശബ്ദമായി നീതിന്യായത്തിൻ ബോധമുണർത്താൻ CG3. CG3. പ്രകാശനത്തിൽ പരിഹരിച്ചിടാം 100,000 ആളിൽ നീറും ദുരിതങ്ങൾ. നൂതന ആശയ പ്രകാശനത്തിൽ പരിഹരിച്ചിടാം 100,000 ആളിൽ നീറും ദുരിതങ്ങൾ. മനുഷ്യത്വ നിറച്ചു നാം മുന്നോട്ടായ നമുക്കീ കൂട്ടായ്മയിൽ സത്യശീലവും ധർമ്മബോധവും കരുത്താകുമീ CG3. നീതിയും നിയമവും ജനപക്ഷത്തൊരുക്കുവാൻ CG3. നിശബ്ദ കണ്ഠങ്ങളിൽ ശബ്ദമായി നീതിന്യായത്തിൻ ബോധമുണർത്താൻ CG3. CG3.
Now, I humbly invite Dr. K.P. Kailas Pillai, Senior Counsel of the Supreme Court of India and Mentor CG3 for the presidential address. Sir.
Good evening to all. Namaskar. Honorable Mr. Justice Devan Ramachandran, Advocate, most distinguished guests and participants. I can see several very familiar faces. Due to paucity of time, I am not citing all names. There are academicians, lawyers, law students, research scholars, judicial officers, and ELSA, members of the Advisory Council of CG3. I bow my head with respect and gratitude to all of you for being present on this occasion. We are celebrating Constitution Day, probably the singular most commendable achievement of India so far in our history. And this day, we are dedicating our celebration to our founding member, who was really, literally at the neonatal stage of this organization, CG3. About CG3, it has been already mentioned by the earlier speakers. I am not standing between the chief speaker and the audience. CG3 is blessed to get good patronage and support from a lot of several quarters, among them the legal fraternity and from the bar as well as from the bench, and also from the general public. So it is really remarkable achievement for CG3 today that we are celebrating the Constitution Day in memory of, and to the core, a very hardworking jurist. In no time, it was a meteoric rise, and unfortunately, we lost him quite unexpectedly. In respect to the memories of Dr. V.L. Mani, I conclude my words because the topic for today's deliberation, today's talk by Most Honorable Mr. Justice Devan Ramachandran is such a resourceful topic, and I am not touching on that topic, but I know that all who have assembled here have some connection with jurisprudence and the legal judicial process in India, and all of us will be having our own opinion on judicial discretion as well as judicial activism. And if I start talking about Justice Devan Ramachandran, I have been watching his progress and his growth as a lawyer, as a commendable performance at the bar, and now as a judge, a prolific judge, very sensible, very sensitive, very much lawyer friendly, subject friendly, society friendly. And I know that we will get a good time spending with listening to the words of wisdom of Justice Devan Ramachandran. Sir, we are happy that you are present amidst us to bless this occasion with the words of wisdom. And I conclude my words And I invite Mr. Justice Devan Ramachandran sir to deliver the address. Hira, please.
Thank you, sir. Now, on behalf of CG3, I'm extremely jubilant and fortunate to invite the man of distinction and embodiment of righteousness and icon of wisdom, Honorable Mr. Justice Devan Ramachandran, Judge, High Court of Kerala, who has proved that human rights are not a brooding omnipotence in the books, but a pragmatic instrument of social justice by delivering a plethora of judgments legally and constitutionally relevant that safeguards the rights of the common man, where no one plucked up so. Moreover, his strong confidence in his conviction and sense of justice has made reach his audible voice against the inhuman demeanor and vocatives of police, organized political suppression, and mismanagement of public servants, causing gross human rights violation to the unorganized common people. Sir, I most honorably invite your lordship to share your insights on the topic judicial discretion versus judicial activism. Sir, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Pillai, for saying things which can never belong to me. But I accept it as your blessings. I was ushered into the profession by my father. I'm sure your words is a reflection of your affection for my father also. In a very heavy day today, I'm still signing my orders and judgments. There are lawyers waiting. So in between, you might see me signing. It is actually my orders and judgments. I'm just signing and delivering it so that it can be uploaded by the end of 7 o'clock. I'm still in my chambers. I just came back from court. I'm so happy that I'm addressing a gathering of all types of intellectuals. And I'm slightly scared that my teacher is also hearing me. I still go back to my college days where Sarojam ma'am could really be a very strong influence. It's a great blessing that she was here. I think she's still here. It's a great blessing for her. But the topic that you have given me, judicial discretion or judicial activism, I must say, I must start with a disclaimer and a confession that I'm certain, like many of you hearing this, I have no idea what it means by saying judicial activism. I have just no idea. In fact, it is one of those words which have been used indiscriminately in almost every sphere of life, but without the persons using it knowing what really it means. I get the feeling these days that any judgment that somebody doesn't like is criticized as being a judgment from judicial activism. If it's a judgment that you like, it is a judgment which is within the parameters of law. If it is a judgment you don't like, you say the judge has acted as an activist. It's a judicial activist judgment. But I have no idea what really is used or what is the meaning that is attributable to the word judicial activism. Many a times I see it in papers or research scholars using it and all that. I did some research. In fact, I didn't do it. I must give that credit to my research assistant who is with my chambers. I didn't have the time to go through it. So he tells me that the word judicial activism was coined by somebody called Arthur Metzlinger in the year 1947 in an article that he published in the Fortune. Now, I tried to get a copy of that article, which again my research assistant was able to give me. It's a well-written article, but there is one problem there. It doesn't define the words. It doesn't define the phrase judicial activism. Nor does it say whether it is good or bad. We can understand what he really meant by that. But then you coined by an Indian or a jurist who's got roots in India. This is all in the domain of the American jurisprudence, where parliamentary supremacy is supposed to be the most important. They give a lot of importance to parliamentary supremacy, and they believe that the laws that are prepared and brought into life by the parliament or by the legislature, as the case may be, or whatever they call it, that is sacrosanct and that cannot be touched. I'm sure many of you know that America never had a system of judicial review, particularly with respect to legislations. The Supreme Court had to wrestle that concept into themselves with the famous Marbury versus Madison judgment. But these concepts, the concept of judicial activism was something that was coined even before that. If you travel back the history of the American legal jurisprudence, you will find that President Joseph, president of the, I forgot his name, he coined that word. He did not use the word judicial activism, but he used the word judicial despotism against Chief Justice Marshall. Thomas Jefferson. My brain is on fire. I've been dictating the whole day, so pardon me for my little lapses in memory. So President Jefferson said Chief Justice Marshall is a judicial despot. Do you know why? Because Chief Justice Marshall was looking into statutes, looking into legislation, striking it down or modulating it if it became necessary. Judiciary was making inroads into the legislature. The original American jurisprudence could not imagine that a judiciary could decide a statute and then render it non-est or illegal merely because it did not comply with the basic statutory precepts. So it is in that context, this gentleman called Arthur Schlesinger also wrote in Fortune. And he said that wherever the judiciary makes inroads, breaching the principles of separation of powers that we relate back to Montesquieu, he said that can only be treated as an activism. Now, the concept of activism, as you know, pure English meaning that you put to it, can only mean that you profess a particular philosophy and you pursue it relentlessly. It is in that context that there are social activists, there are all kinds of activists, forest activists who tie themselves to the tree so that a tree is not cut down. We have lawyers also among us who are equally passionate about nature. I'm sure some of them are there with us. So wherever you feel very passionate about a particular concept and you devote yourself to the strength of that particular philosophy, you're generally called an activist because it is more than a mere passion. It is an action that combines to bring out something in terms of action. This is why you have that young lady who is now this is the concept of an activist. But when the word activist is joined with the word judicial, and somebody is defined as being a judicial activist, including a judge or a lawyer, doesn't matter who it is, there is a kind of a derision attached to it. It is generally used pejoratively. I do not know why. Because judicial activism, according to me, is a good thing. Of course, as Chief Justice Cardoso said, a judge is not a knight in rent who can roam around, in his concept of beauty or correctness. That is right. We may be free, but we are not really free. That's what he said. We are certainly circumscribed by various limitations, including of limitations of jurisdictions, limitations of power, and limitations of reach. But then, as long as we work within the parameters of law, within the judicial principles, of the legal principles, I think it is incumbent upon every judge, even a lawyer, to be passionate about what you do and to ensure that results are enlivened with the effort that you take. I say this because if you see the normal concept of judicial restraint, which began again maybe 2-3 centuries ago, it is also called the judicial minimalism. Basically, what they say is that you decide the list, you decide the case, and leave it there. Don't get identified with the cause. You decide the cause with respect to the people involved, leave it to them. Let them come back to you if there is a problem, but you don't involve yourself. It is a case of, it is a principle of detachment, a decapitated kind of a situation where you are not concerned about the cause, but you're only concerned about the list. Now, we are all human beings. We are all people who have our own philosophies. And therefore, the principles of judicial minimalism, enjoins that you don't carry your philosophy decisions that you take. You follow what is written before you. You follow the precedents, the principles of stare decisis, and then follow it to the hilt. Don't go beyond the law. Remain within the parameters of law. Confine yourself to the perimeters that are stipulated by the legislature or the parliament, and then remain within it and do your job. This is what, in an oversimplified manner, one could possibly define judicial minimalism or judicial restraint. Of course, as all of you know, judicial activism is virtually an antonym to the concept of judicial restraint. Now, I think, particularly in the judiciary in India, most of us walk somewhere in between judicial restraint in its pristine form and judicial activism as has been now defined by the American press and the American jurists in a pejorative manner. We are not really activists in the sense that we are not trying to make laws. We certainly are not. I don't think even judgments that are now, accused of being activists really make laws. Because if you see, for example, just take a very small example. When the Supreme Court says that the auto rickshaws and the taxis in the Union Territory of Delhi will be henceforth run on CNG, some people might feel that this is a classic case of activism. But look at it. Is it not upon the executive and the other machinery of the government to ensure that the right to clean air? It is when they don't do that the courts are forced to step in. If the executive and the other machinery of the government does their job well, take it from me, the judiciary will not have much of a job to do. So everybody knows that we have a constitutional right to live. We have a constitutional right to good air, good environment, and good nature. We are all having a fundamental duty to protect the environment. But still, when the air becomes so polluted, only because the government is unable to step in on account of their various constraints, vote banks and such other, that the judiciary in India may have to do that because we are the sentinel on the qui vive as far as the people's liberties are concerned. So in the position that I'm today sitting and the jurisdiction that I'm holding today, it'll be very difficult for me to speak on the various nuances and instances of what others might perceive as judicial activism. But suffice to say, what we are really trying to do is to be with the society. Now, I think it was Dr. Pillai who said, I was society friendly. I take it as a compliment. And this is exactly what is known as activism in this country. This is the problem. When a judge is perceived to be society friendly, when a judge is perceived to be on the side of the individual citizen, and when a judge takes a decision in furtherance of the inviolable human rights of its citizens, he or she is then perceived and branded as an activist. Because those judgments or those orders that we now issue are not liked by those people who are used to not being questioned and taken to accountability. What does the judiciary do? You see, as I was saying, in the United States concepts, there was no judicial review until the Marbury versus Madison judgment. But in India, unfortunately for us, being a constitutional day today, we must really thank our Constituent Assembly. Article 13 is the most potent. And Dr. Ambedkar also said that the power of judicial review is the foundations of our democracy. So we have a constitutionally inbuilt obligation on the constitutional courts to review review legislations and ensure that they fall within the parameters of the Constitution. Our Constitution is the suprema lex. It is the highest law of the land. As H.L.A. Hart said, it is a grand norm. It is the highest law, to which every other statute, every other law has to conform. So as a constitutional court, high courts and supreme courts under the Indian Constitution, with the powers that are given to us as varied under Articles 226 and Article 32, coupled with Articles 142 and 141, there is no doubt that the Indian judiciary is one of the most powerful, at least as far as the constitutional liberties are concerned. Therefore, we have an obligation. We are under a trust to act not merely within the four letters of these statutes that are brought within us, but we also have a duty to find out whether the statute is being put to good use, whether it is being operated properly, whether the people who are in charge of the operation act in the manner as they are expected to do. But unfortunately, when some court or the other does this, the branding of the judicial activism starts. That is why I said nobody really knows in India, or for that part, even in any other part of the world, what really judicial activism is. Just because somebody called Arthur Schlesinger thought that a judge who sets aside a legislation is a judicial activist, in the sense that the court is now trying to legislate. This is now being used indiscriminately everywhere to mean that every judgment that you don't like, as I said earlier, is a consequence of judicial activism. So now what we now see, if you please go through the reports that you find, the critiques that you see. Every time you find a judgment to be accused of being the product of judicial activism, you would find that that judgment, really speaking, encompasses somebody or the other's most inviolable human rights or liberties. So therefore, when a list is brought to my court, I have my discretion either to accept it or not to accept it. This is the discretion that a Superior Court judge is given under Article 226 of the Constitution. Now, when that list is brought to me, at the threshold, I can decide to dismiss it or to admit it. Nobody can ask me why. It is my mentation. It is a ratiocination that I follow to decide even whether I want to admit it or dismiss it. And therefore, that kind of discretion that is given to you, when the state and the citizenry trust you with the kind of discretion, which is unheard of in most of the other jurisprudences, the corollary question asks, or the corollary question that attaches itself is whether am I expected to merely follow the law to the hilt, go with the rule, go with the letter of the statute, and then stop ourselves, even if we see that it is not being operated well, that the persons who are entrusted with its enforcement are not doing their job well, or can we go slightly forward within the parameters of the law that we are tied by, sequestered by, and ensure that every citizen of this country gets what his due is. Every tear is wiped off. This might sound utopian, but everything there is a start. Every journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, as they say. So unless we make that step and we decide not to move on because of the conventional principles of judicial minimalism, I dare say that the situation in India would have been very, very different. This is not something that is happening today. This is something that has been there ever since the Constitution was adopted by our great nation. Every time judiciary has stepped in, whenever there were statutes which were not in conformity with our constitutional ethos, several statutes have been set aside. You are aware of the innovations that have been done by the Supreme Court and the High Courts. We are sitting here in the 21st century today to a large extent because of such innovations. They are not judicial activism. They're actually judicial positivism. Now, what is positivism and activism? There is a blurred, fine line. When one man's positivism perhaps is, always described as the activism of the other. But in my view, in my personal opinion, there is nothing called judicial activism when we operate within the contours of the Indian Constitution. Our Constitution is the most supreme. We don't believe in parliamentary supremacy. We believe in constitutional supremacy. And therefore, any statute, any action which is unconstitutional, it is my obligation as a Superior Court judge and as the obligation of all my brothers adorning the chairs in all these courts to step in and set it right. Of course, it doesn't mean, as I said, Justice Cardoso said, that I'm a knight errant going in, galloping on my horse in a mad pursuit of what is right and wrong. That is not what we are expected to do. And that is not what we are doing. But when a list comes to us, for example, I'll make it easier for you to understand. Suppose there is a list before me. I deliver a judgment. It is not then implemented. The normal norm is that one of the parties to the list must come here with either a contempt of court case or an Article 215 application, or if it is under the civil law, an execution petition or whatever, and then get the judgment to be delivered, to be implemented. But look at it from the other angle. When we deliver a judgment under Article 226 of the Constitution of India, much as the Honorable Supreme Court under Article 32, which of course has a greater protection under Article 142 of the Constitution. Is it not intended to be implemented? Should we really burden the litigant to come back again, knocking our doors, spending and expending large amounts of money, using great lawyers, to tell us that our judgments are not being implemented? And if they do so, are we to be a mute spectator and find out what the authorities are doing, and then bow down on the principles of judicial minimalism? I'm sorry, I do not think that the judges of this era would possibly subscribe to that. When our judgments are not heard, I had to say this even yesterday in court. When we deliver a judgment, it is intended to be heard and it is intended to be remembered. But unfortunately, what we see these days is that judgments are delivered and it is forgotten. Nobody remembers what the judgment was, what the intention was, what the directions were. A judgment is simply meant to be a part of the various law reports that you find, which in any event, very seldom do we read anymore. So once a judgment delivered, everybody forgets it. And that is why the Honorable Supreme Court thought of the principle of continuing mandamus, which is actually an invention by the common law jurisprudence. You continue to keep on to a case because you don't let somebody forget. For example, the most important and the most noteworthy was the preservation of trees case, the Thirumalpad matter, which went on. Justice Kuldeep Singh started it. It still is on. It still is enlivened. It is still going on. Godavarman Thirumalpad matter. This is a case of invention by the Supreme Court, continuing mandamus. Every case was tagged along with that. Directions were issued. And because of that, India is a different country today. We have been able to protect a large amount of our resources. Similar, for example, when the Supreme Court makes its force, these are not really activism. These are all principles of being put into operation. After all, what is mandamus? When a public authority refuses or fails to do their duty, the courts are enjoined with a responsibility to compel them to do so. This is exactly what we are trying to do. Exactly what we normally do. But sometimes when it is done, all judicial activist judgments, as they call it, they are all judgments which have dealt with human rights or such other inalienable rights and duties of citizens. You can take it and you will see that. Of course, the courts may have its own philosophy and its own reasoning for entering into a particular decision. But then the principles that we normally adopt, they normally adopt in the US on the questions of restraint and on the requirements of minimalism would not apply to a country like India, where we have a wonderful constitution, which we have adopted to ourselves 72 years ago this day. It's one of the most remarkable constitutions. And in fact, I am asked to speak on the constitution at the University of Kerala tomorrow, which I'll be doing it physically. I'm glad that there is a newfound or a resurgent recognition of our constitutional principles, because whatever be the differences that we may have, we are a large society, a large country of over 140 crores, which perhaps is the largest denomination of this earth. Each of us are different. Every one of us have our own philosophy. We have our own needs. We have our own thoughts. We have our own ways of thinking. But we are all bonded by one force, one guiding force, which is the Constitution. And every judge, every lawyer, every citizen of this country must be governed by the constitutional morality, the constitutional conscience, and the constitutional ethos, which will then bind us into one nation. And it is because of this one constitution, which has remained unshaken for the last 71 years, that we are still a great nation, bound together without any so judicial activism is without understanding what it really means, a tool to discourage judges to act as per the constitutional conscience and to rise in defense of the hapless citizen, the most vulnerable. And I'm sure that the legends of our jurisprudence, Justice Krishna and Justice Khanna, all those people have broken those shackles. Otherwise, how could we have a concept of public interest litigation at all? Going by the fundamental and the most conservative principles of jurisprudence, how could anybody file a writ petition unless you are directly affected? So the Supreme Court broke the shackles in early 70s. And today, India is a different country altogether. We are able to bring the concerns and the cries of multitudes of millions of people before courts when they are not able to do so. This is the greatness of our country. This is the strength of our judiciary. And I do not think that I will ever belittle my judiciary with any word or any phrase like the judicial activist. Of course, what is wrong is what is wrong. If I choose to write a judgment based on my predilections without understanding my constitutional obligations, it is a wrong judgment. It is not a case of judicial activism. It is a case of judicial misdemeanor. And if I do so, I must certainly face the consequences, including that my judgment will stand set aside. But that doesn't mean that that is a judgment of judicial activism. Because as they say, there is nothing called a necessary evil. What is necessary is not an evil, and what is evil can never be a necessity. Similarly, there is no judicial activism. It is either a judicial action or a judicial misaction. Judicial actions are always accepted. Judicial misactions are never accepted. Judicial misactions are those classes where I decide to decide a case on an agenda, on something which is completely alien to the parties or to the concept or the cause. And I decide a matter because I choose to decide it, but that is hedonistic, that is absolutely arrogant behavior and nothing else. So that is not judicial activism. So the American concept of judicial activism was where a judge would set aside a legislation. In India, that is not a problem at all because Article 13 equips each of us on the superior courts to do so when the matter comes to us. And we are expected to do so. Similarly, when a writ petition is brought to us under the ambit of Article 226 of the Constitution of India, every citizen does so because either their fundamental right or any other right is violated. Similarly, before the Supreme Court, it is a fundamental right. So when a citizen comes to you saying that my fundamental right is violated or my statutory right is violated, am I to sit there and then decide the list before me and then decide that I will not travel forward? Sometimes a citizen who is not really on par with the government, with its monolith machinery, would not get justice. As I've always been saying, there's a large amount of difference between justice and law. Law are set of parameters and sets of rules that we have to follow, but that doesn't always get you justice. Justice, the principle of justice is to give every citizen his due, for which matter sometimes we may have to mold the law, we may have to mold the relief, which we normally do, and which we have the sanction from the Supreme Court in a series of judgments, including which was delivered by Justice V.R. Krishna. So this is in fact the principle of oversimplified manner of dealing with judicial activism. And I'm putting it to you that in my view, there is absolutely nothing called a judicial activism as far as India is concerned, and it cannot apply also because every judge is expected to act as per the Constitution. And we are guided by Article 13 of the Constitution of India, much as Article 226 and 32. Discretion, of course, is what we always have in our pursuit of the constitutional obligations. The discretion is given to us because the Constitution renders us the trustees of the conscience of our people. Look at the kind of burden that we carry, the responsibility that we carry. We must be always conscious of that responsibility. We carry the conscience of the 140 crore Indians whom we represent as trustees. And it is our obligation to ensure to him, to the limits of our jurisdiction, our competence, we are not gods after all, to give them what is due to them, to ensure that the capricious actions of the state or the executive do not constrain them and leave them in despair or without hope. It is our duty to do that. And if doing so, we are perceived to be crossing the lines a little bit here and there, it is just a flexing of the joints and nothing more, nothing less. So discretion is necessary. And I believe that there is no activism. I don't like to be called an activist judge. I am not an activist judge. I'm a constitutional judge who strongly believes in the Constitution, and this is what I say in my quote every day. I'm sure lawyers who hear me must be getting bored by the use of the word Constitution by me every day, every moment, because I believe that if all the constituents of our society understand what Constitution is, understands what our preamble is, our nation will reach heights which is incapable of by any nation in the world. We were like that in the past. It was a colonial subjugation that has now reduced us to this level. We must break those shackles, come out of it, understand the Constitution can lead us. It's the greatest constitution in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking your valuable time and sharing your take on the concept of judicial activism, and also giving us an in-depth insight within this short span of time, stating the working between judicial restraint or judicial activism in context of India, and also about constitutional liberty and the different perspectives of positives. Thank you so much, sir, once again, and hope this gives a different perspective to this concept in the fraternity, as well as the upcoming generations who wish to take upon law. It was such a privilege to hear from you. Thank you once again, sir, on behalf of CG3. And now the floor is open for the interactive session. The participants can unmute their mic and ask the questions, or you can put in your questions in the chat box. You can also share your opinions or feedbacks.
Did I speak too much that nobody wants to ask any questions any further?
No, sir. As you said, the Constitution is one of the biggest and the largest, and with the exhaustive type, all the rules are there, regulations are there, law is there. But we can see, even after having all this in our system, we can see executive excesses, erring executives. Why it is happening so much, and it is killing the society. Basically, it is affecting the society, the life of the society also, the people also, citizens also. And you can also see that political excesses, that is also very big and hugely happening in India. And that is also affecting the, social life. And there is also trading excesses. If you look into the trading people, the manner in which they trade, the way in which they trade, there also you can see the excesses. They are cheating the people also. And you can also see the gundaism or the muscle power of the people also. So how these excesses, because these situations are all creating problem to the society and the citizens also. And why can't, if it is called that social activism, why can't the judges take the activism itself and punish these erring peoples? What is wrong in that? Why it is not happening?
I know that this is the sentiment of an average citizen in India, and I get a lot of such questions. I get a lot of letters asking, why are you still not going beyond what you are doing now? This is what I said. Imagine, even with the little that we do now, the allegation is, now to come back to your question, you're Mr. Roy, Robbie. Mr. Robbie. You see, excesses are not something which is confined to India. Please understand that. This happens all over the world. As long as men are greedy, and men, I want to be gender neutral, men takes in women, so therefore women or men, are greedy, excesses around the world can never stop. Men will always be men. And therefore, it's when you pursue an action solely for your benefit or for the benefit of something that you want to advance. All these cases of excesses happen. Suppose you understand that your obligation is to work for your brother. You are your brother's keeper. And you are enjoined in the law or the Constitution to ensure that the others are also equally entitled to live the manner that you are. I'm sure that none of us would like to tread beyond the limits that the law or the Constitution keeps for us. But then tragically, that is not the case. We are not living in a utopia, certainly not. And in India, maybe the numbers are slightly higher because our numbers of people itself are higher. As I was saying, 140 crores is not a small number. It's the largest group in the world. So therefore, when the resources are lesser, when the rush for your own purposes are higher, certainly excesses are bound to happen. Because that's because the system works with a lot of agendas. The system doesn't work with the Constitution alone in mind. But as you said, if all of us work with the Constitution in mind, nothing else, of course, this will be heaven. I do not know whether this will happen. It might happen. We are waiting for it. That is why we are all working. On the question of excesses and all that, see, I don't have the power to punish the manner you think I have the power. This is why yesterday I said people think that we are all powerful. We are not all powerful. We also have limitations. That is because it's essential. Otherwise, I will be also a person who will be tomorrow accused of being an autocrat. There are checks and balances. There are absolute separation of powers. The Montesquieuian concept of separation of powers is still very valid and very, very important. Without that, no branch of the government or the nation can become auto powerful and all powerful than the other. So we are trying our best to the extent that we can. When a matter is brought to our notice, we certainly react. And as long as we react within the contours of the Constitution and taking into account the tier of a citizen, I think we cannot be found fault with. Minor, complaints can arise, but they are all, very small casualties in the larger picture, of course.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you.
In fact, I'm reminded about the words of Dr. Ambedkar. He said after the Constitution came into force, he said, this Constitution can never be bad. And he said, if this Constitution fails, it is not because it is bad. It is because the people are vile, V-I-L-E. He said the people are bad. So it's not the Constitution is bad. It is because the people who man it may be bad. But our Constitution is still holding on. It has not failed.
Very true, sir. Very true.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for that invigorating lecture. My name is Sharath Mohan. I am a research scholar at School of Legal Studies, CUSAT. So I have a small question. I don't know whether this will suit your speech. With regard to stare decisions that you were talking about, how does a judge, tend to overcome the precedent that is set when it is, maybe a slightly difficult proposition to take? And there may be a shade of people alleging that it is a judicial activism in one sense, where you're going beyond the precedentary value or breaking the stare decisis as such, maybe to bring justice in one way. What's your take on that? Whether the judge should be, always follow the precedent and stick on the stare decisis, or take a strong stand to that?
In my opening speech, because I didn't have too much of time to reflect on each concept very detailed. You see, judicial activism is certainly also attributed to a case where a judge deliberately does not follow a set precedent. There's no doubt about that. As I was saying, that is not judicial activism, that is judicial indiscipline. But then you should understand what really is a precedent and what really is the concept of stare decisis. Every judgment is edificed on the facts that are noticed. So on the set of the facts, if there are identical facts which are very unlikely, then certainly there is no question of a judge not following a set precedent. If he does that, as I said, it is not activism. It is plain and simple misconduct, judicial indiscipline. But then when matters come to us, when we evaluate the facts first, so we are not looking at the precedents and then going to the facts. It is just the way around. We look at the facts first. And if the facts are identical or analogous or similar, much to what you think otherwise, we are not fancying to a precedent. At least I'll tell you for myself, I am a judge who believes in following precedents. I'm a judge who definitely believes that unless it is absolutely necessary, you have to follow the set beaten path, because otherwise there will be no uniformity. There will be no order. It will be a certain amount of chaos. So I am not saying that you shall not. I'm not one of those people who say you must break the stare decisis principles and write what you want. Not at all. That is pure and simple judicial indiscipline. I'm not a votary of judicial indiscipline. But then if the facts are different, just coming to the question that you asked me, how can we get over a precedent? We don't want to get over a precedent, but we are forced to do that. The only method of doing it is by seeing the facts. As I always tell my young lawyers who come to me, the first thing that they do is they come to me and say, Milord, there is a judgment, 2008, 1 KLT 73. I say, please tell me the facts first. Because the facts are the skeleton. The precedents are only the flesh and the blood at all. So unless you have the skeleton, how does the frame stand up? It cannot stand up. So if the facts are different, and if I'm able to distinguish the facts, then certainly the precedent may not apply, because a precedent applies only in the given circumstance of the facts. So this is how we broaden the principles of precedents. Otherwise, what happens is there will be 10 judgments will operate as a precedent for all cases forever to come. No. Look at the number of precedents that are being set up. Please see our law reports. Every week, we will have about 20, 30, 40 judgments from various benches of our court, which are all precedents. That is because the facts differ, the circumstances differ, and we are then obligated to deliver judgments based on the same. But as far as the facts are, as long as the facts are same, as long as the circumstances are similar, we will follow the precedent. Unless we think that suppose I think I cannot follow a precedent, there's a method of doing it. I have to refer to a larger bench, request the Honorable Chief Justice to constitute a bigger bench to consider the matter. Classic, you are seeing the Sabarimala matter. The review has gone into a constitutional bench. So that is judicial discipline. The line may be very blurred, but what you just told me is judicial indiscipline and not judicial activist. Though in the American concept, that also comes under the concept of judicial activist.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
It's a great question, but thank you for asking.
Sir, can I just ask you a question, sir?
Praveen, yes, Praveen. Good to see you.
Sir, you just said about the difference between a court of law and a court of justice. Now, do we have a system? Does our system view the person who approaches the court of justice with suspicion to an extent of pushing him to manage the executive or waive his rights, rather than going through the technicalities of law? Now, often the person who approaches the court is put to all through technicalities. Is there a situation like that, sir?
Praveen, I'll cross my heart and tell you that I am not like that. I have no suspicion of any petitioner.
I'm sure.
And I think my philosophy is well recognized. I say that I'm a person to grant and not to deny. As long as I can grant, I will grant. If I can't, I deny. That's all. That's the principle that I follow. But then I go back to my lawyering days. Sometimes I used to feel whether every petitioner is viewed with a certain amount of suspicion. I've never been able to understand that, really speaking. And I cannot do so because of the law before I enter. There cannot be any doubt that nobody comes to the court as they come to a mall or to loiter around like in a park. It is only when he is pushed to the corner, he is pushed to the that is the end game that he is playing. But what you ask me is the other way around. Some people may feel that coming to a court will not really get you anything. So is it not better that I go to the executive or to the authorities and spend a fraction of what I spend on litigation on the lawyers, on the court fee and all that, try to manipulate the system? Yes, it is happening. But I'm really proud to say this, and I'm very glad to say this, that there is a clear change of perception. There is a perception among litigants. I can see that when I interact with them, when I get letters, when I get phone calls. They have some faith in the system now, in the judicial system now. There is no doubt about it. They believe, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Because about litigants, society also has a great suspicion about judges and lawyers. They don't believe we are honest. And that goes with every lawyer, every judge. every litigant or citizen would start with the initial precept that every judge is corrupt, every lawyer is dishonest. It is our duty now as members of the bar, as members on the bench, it is our duty to bring back the faith. As they say, sometimes theatrics may be required. What is happening? I'm glad, they never knew what we were doing. They thought that we were all loitering our time. We were all wasting our time in court, doing nothing, enjoying our good life. At least now they will see that we are all handling more than 200 matters a day. We are disposing of 50, 60 matters with maybe 120 interim orders. The system, the trust in the system has to be restored. We are all trying to do that. Believe us, this is all what we are trying to do. We want the bar also to come. We will have to walk together. Certainly, the time is not very far when every individual will understand that coming to a court would get them the result that they want.
Thank you, sir.
As I said in the court, Praveen, I don't know if you heard, I said I'm a diehard optimist. Pardon me.
I'm sure, sir. I personally know that.
Any further question? You can proceed with that because time is now 7:03. I think
ma'am, if may I ask one more question if it is
yeah,
okay?
sure. Yeah.
So, regard to the comment made by Mr. K.K. Venugopal, when there was a series of judgment which tried to bring up the concept of constitutional morality. Now he was commenting that already the judges have constitutionality. So constitutionality can be brought up. What we have using it as a concept. How do you see that?
I did not hear the Attorney General's comment on this. This is the first time I'm hearing this. But this is something possibly which many people would have in their mind. As I said in my opening speech, it's not merely constitutional morality, it is also the constitutional conscience. See, what is really constitutional morality? When we say constitutional conscience and constitutional morality, it means something that is common to every one of us, 140 crore of people. How can you say that there is no life to it? That is the only life. Otherwise, we will all be, running around with our own morals and our own conscience. I've heard judges who retire to say that I've acted as per my conscience. Always felt it is not your conscience that you should be acting upon. It is a constitutional conscience. I'm very careful to say as per my conscience. I've acted as per the constitutional conscience as I can perceive it. I may not be right always, but then if I act as per conscience which is not mine, then it is very easy for anybody else to correct me. It's a morality that serves. But then when your concept of morality take precedence of constitutional morality, that is where we are in trouble. So I do not know how the Attorney General said this. I am sure he did not mean it in that sense. Certainly, we have our own moralities. And suppose I start dictating judgments, I deliver judgments on my morality. It's going to be chaos. I cannot do that. So I may not believe in a particular concept. I may not find favor with a particular, a concept of morality, as you call it. I may not find favor with you. But when I understand that that is a morality which has got some deep-rooted ingrains within the Constitution, I am bound to follow as a judge. To that extent, I am certain you can tell the Attorney General that constitutional morality is something that we cannot keep away. It is certainly to stay. It will be there. It has always been there. It will always be there.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good evening, sir. May I ask you one advice? My name is Thomas Joseph. Recently, I joined for a special batch 3-year LLB course in Law Academy. After in my professional field, in field of engineering for 25 years, I decided to pursue this law degree and started going through the constitutional law, law of contracts, jurisprudence, etc. It's very new to me and most of our batchmates. That give some advice to us, so that that will be very motivational for us.
5 years and about 3 months ago, I stopped giving advices. I am in a job where advice is never to be given and it is never relished. What advice can I give? There is no advice. It's an advice to all of us. Follow the Constitution. Be a good citizen. Don't live within your parochial limits. Live for the other. Feel for the poor. As Vivekananda said, feel my child, feel for the poor, feel for the downtrodden, feel for the uneducated. Feel until your heart aches and your head reels and you feel that your mind will go mad. It's that kind of passion that every Indian has to have. If you start believing that you live for another, that every countryman is your own brother, your own sister, this country is going to be the highest and the greatest ever seen in this world. This is all that I can tell. This is all that I want the country to become. And I hope one day, as I said just now, I'm a diehard. I have no doubt that India is going to be the greatest.
Thank you, sir.
Please read the Constitution. You said you just joined law. Please read the Constitution to the extent times. I'm not talking about the nitty-gritty. Just go through part 4. Just go through the preamble. Your vision about life will change. Because as they say, our Constitution is a bag of borrowings. That is used in a sardonic manner. But then please understand that we have pulled out and culled out the best of every Constitution. And we have put that into our Constitution as a basket of borrowings, as they call it. But that's not a bad thing. We have got the best of everything. And if you follow that, our country can never go wrong. Believe me, every deleterious conduct that you see today in the main field, everything that you find in televisions and papers, look at it very carefully. It's all because you are not following the ethos of our country. It's all because people have their own agenda. They have their own vision for themselves, greedy, avarice, and this is why things are happening. Of course, it's not possible for me to say that there will be a time when there will be no violence, there will be no misdemeanor, there will be no misconduct. No, it's not going to happen that way. But if each one of us take an oath to go by the Constitution and understand that our country has lived on the ethos of sharing and suffering, our independence struggle itself, and if we believe in that, instead of speaking romantically about the independence and the pre-partition struggles and all that, your perceptions about life will change. You are in a country which is spiritually gated. We are in a country which has got the greatest history in the world. Not many countries can speak about a history which travels down 2,000 years. We have a civilization which is over 2,000 years. So this is the greatness of our country. In the fundamentals, you to be excellent in anything that you do. So it's a constitutional obligation on every citizen of this nation to be excellent, to excel in what you do.
Thank you, sir.
It is not an option, it is an obligation.
Thank you very much.
Moving to the are there any queries?
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
This is Kumar Challapan, a journalist. And let me tell you first that I got this courage to ask this question to you because of the courage you gave us through your observations in some of the recent cases in the Kerala High Court, especially the queue in front of this Indian-made foreign liquor outlets where you gave a piece of your mind to the government. That's really amazing, and let me begin with congratulating you. These are certain things which we were very much afraid to write about because of the so-called morality being practiced by the press. And since you have spoken your mind out on this issue, let me take this opportunity, today being the Constitution Day, I would like to ask you a question. This preamble to the Constitution was amended sometime in 1976 during the peak day of emergency by inserting the words socialism, secularism, something like that. We became a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. And this was done by amending the Constitution in the absence of almost all the opposition leaders who were jailed under MISA and DIR. Wasn't it an unconstitutional act? And it is time for us to rectify this act if it is wrong. Why I'm specifically asking this question is that now we are telling that we are a socialist country. Socialism is a political way of thinking. And tomorrow, some Hindu sellouts come to power. Don't you think that there's a possibility of them amending the Constitution and declaring it as a Hindu republic? I'm sorry, the question is wrong. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
I'll just correct you first. The preamble was, even though our constitution has been amended 104 or 105 times, the preamble has been amended only once in the year 1976 to bring in the word socialist, nothing else. See, as we speak today, the Indian Constitution, the preamble says, we are a secular, sovereign, socialist, democratic republic. The word socialist was introduced. Now, sitting in my chair, it may be very difficult for me to reflect upon the circumstances which led to the introduction of that particular word into the preamble. But when you read the Constitution as a whole, the word socialist did not really make any difference, merely because it is introduced into the preamble. The Constitution continued to be an organic document. It's a document that reflects the aspirations of our people. All our policies are governed by the preambular concepts. The word socialist, though introduced specifically, really did not change the manner of the Constitution, nor did it bring out any difference into the meaning of the preamble. Believe me, if you really go through the Constitution prior to that, it was designed to be a socialist organic document. It continues to be. So your apprehension that somebody can now come and change the Constitution is not possible because of the Kesavananda Bharati doctrine of basic structure. It is not possible. Now, an absolute majoritarian an attempt in the future, I do not know. But I would gather that as long as our judiciary is strong, that may not be possible. Because I said earlier, as long as Article 13 is there, and as long as we are governed by the principles of the basic doctrine, it will be very difficult to change the Constitution. You see, various other countries, I'm told that Russia, for example, changed their constitution completely. India, it is not possible. As long as we are alive, as long as our country continues, the Constitution will live.
Thanks, Justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you for asking.
It's 7:15.
7, yeah.
Questions can be, I think there can be a last question now. If His Lordship permits.
I have no problem.
I hope there are no more queries. First of all, I would like to thank your Lordship for spending so much time with us and for promptly giving us response. And I thank the participants for cooperating.
Much as I believe in the Constitution, I would request you not to call me Lordship also.
Sure. And I thank the participants for cooperating and the wonderful questions posed here today. Thank you once again all. Now, gratitude turns what we have into enough. I humbly request Advocate Nagaraj Narayan Sir, Special Government Pleader of the High Court of Kerala, the Director of Kerala Law Academy, as well as an esteemed member of CG3 Advisory Council, to propose the vote of thanks. So please.
Respected Honorable Mr. Justice Devan sir, respected teacher, my teacher, Dr. Kailas Nadavula sir, other distinguished members on the virtual dais, and dear friends, brothers and sisters. We had a very eloquent, as usual, speech by Justice Devan sir. So we have heard of we have come across a lot of scholarly articles on judicial activism, judicial restraint, and committed judiciary. Constitutional history is full of such instances. Now, maybe for the first time we have a new picture, a new, maybe indigenously developed or something which is innovative, new structure where sir would say that there is no such word as judicial activism. It is only judicial positivism. It is something which is only part of judicial review, wherein the judge is only doing is part of being part of the cause, doing his duty of disposing the cause of the dispute or the legacy. Now we came across a lot of historical events. Came with Devan sir took us initially to Madbury versus Madison, the 19th century. The first year of the 19th century saw this in 1803, if I'm correct. And Thomas Jefferson, Chief Justice Marshall, along with Peterson, Chase, and Washington. Maybe it's the first time in the history of American Constitution that judicial review extended, or the concept of judicial review was expanded to its present form, what we see in the United States now, and what we experience in India. Maybe that is what we found in Keshav Singh case also, the conflict between parliamentary sovereignty, which is a concept ingrained in the British parliamentary system, which we have borrowed, and the judicial review concept from the United States Constitution, which brought in by the Madbury versus Madison decision. And of course, there have been so many instances of new deal legislation. A pragmatic judge of all times said, well, we owe to those judges who owe to those philosophy of our century and not to those outgrown philosophies of the years. That is why Justice Cardoso said we should go by the philosophy of what the travel is of today and not of the travel when the bullock cart was there. So we owe to philosophies, economic, social, and political of our times and the causes. But of course, there are other issues of judicial accountability and other issues. And it started with Thomas Jefferson, Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. The fight resulted in the present day judicial review in there. And of course, there is also the issue of discretion versus what we call as judicial activism, as it said, where law ends, tyranny begins, and where law ends, tyranny need not always begin, but discretion can also be there. And as Casey Davis said, it is a question of confining, structuring, and checking discretion. And the issue is, what are the limits of judicial action, the limits of judicial review, versus the positivist role, as their lordship said about this. Very beautifully, Justice Devan sir has said about judicial minimalism, which is equated to judicial restraint, wherein the judge detaches himself and says, I am only about this. Now, this is only saying, maybe I can put the justice words in another way. The law we are dealing is a living organism and not a dead body. If it is a dead body, then of course the judicial restraint, the judicial minimalism could be there. But when we are living dealing with law as a living organism. Whatever is said, there is no other option but only to agree to their lordship. And with, I may sum up with these words. Maybe I'm not transgressing too much into others' time. So I will just sum up with these words. And I should say that today's speech was so enlightening, so innovative, has put in something which I would say that I have heard this such a view for the first time. Maybe for the first time in my history that I have heard such a view of judicial activism is not there, but only it is judicial positivism. And it is the opposite of judicial minimalism. And of course, that is something which would have enlightened all of us. And I would say that we could see so many lawyers from the High Court, because Justice Devan Ramanathan sir is here. I found so many. I cannot name all the names. I found senior advocates, Zebra Makaran sir here. This is K.L. Varghese sir here. So many senior lawyers, senior designated lawyers. Then, of course, lawyers from various bars, from Neyatingara bar I could see, from Trivandrum bar I could see, from Pathanamthitta bar I could see. Maybe this was given when Justice Devan sir was speaking. Now, the bar in Kerala, of course, gives its ear. Very happy that it was so enlightening, and all the persons here would be so much happy and enlightened and illuminated by these words of wisdom as to this. And on behalf of all those present here and on behalf of CG3, I extend to you, sir, Justice Devan Ramanathan sir, a very warm thanks, a very heartfelt thanks. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Then I should thank, I need not thank Kailas Nadavula sir, who was my teacher, who is still my teacher, senior lawyer, designated lawyer, senior designated lawyer and lawyer in the Supreme Court, has been organizing so many activities in the name of CG3, taking classes for Panchayat members, involving the bureaucrats, politically wise leaders, and also judicial officers to train the municipality and Panchayat councillors, and so many activities. And as my teacher and for all this and the opportunity and for organizing this function and giving all the persons such a good platform to hear and listen to Justice Devan sir, I extend to you, sir, Kailas Nadavula sir, a formal thanks, sir. Thank you, sir. And Bintu, then Sarafina, Ilyas, then the copier, Haira, Solomon, all did very well, control the program very well. And thanks to due to all of you. And I also thank all the faculty members of various institutions, students of various institutions, researchers, journalists, others. And more importantly, I would thank all the lawyers, High Court lawyers, lawyers from Trivandrum, lawyers from all over the state who have actively been here. And even now we had nearly 300 people at a stretch. And even now we have around 217 people for their enthusiasm for being here for so long and for listening to their lordship's speech. On behalf of CG3 and all those present here, I extend to all of you a heartfelt thanks. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. I once again thank the Honorable Justice for his valuable time and all the participants. With this, we have come to the end of our session. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Sir, please unmute Kailas sir. Please unmute, sir.
I really thank Advocate Nagaraj Narayan for making such a comprehensive vote of thanks, touching on various aspects covered by Honorable Mr. Justice Devan Ramachandran sir. And I will refer to two comments and conclude my words. One, Mr. Roby said 3 words: great, wonderful, inspiring. And Advocate R. Sandhanakrishnan from Supreme Court Bar, he made an observation that it is inspiring and beautiful. A former president of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. And the third observation from Mr. P.B. Advocate P.B. Sahasranaman, again referring to the beauty of the speech. So there was philosophy in it, there is history in it, there is jurisprudence in it, there is constitutionalism in it, there is activism in it, there is discretion exercise. So it was a multi-faceted view of a multi-faceted bench of Kerala High Court. All of us can be proud of. And CG3 is always indebted to this occasion, and the speech delivered by informative, educative. Thank you, sir. Thank you all. A lot of tremendous response from the bar, from various parts of our country. Let our constitution flourish, as our judge, our honorable judge said. Let us be positive. Thank you. Jai Hind.